Hello, everybody. All right, welcome to the Mikestand. Today is, of course, um, February the 24th, 2026. If you haven't, Tuesday, February 24th, 2026. If you haven't already, you guys can help out by liking and sharing the stream. See if we can get some more friendly people to engage. That'd be appreciated. Also, if anything here grabs your attention, feel free to comment and or ask questions, and I will try to answer the questions to the best of my ability. That being said, we're just going to wait a few minutes to give people a chance to come in before we go. I know that, of course, tonight is the here in the States, it's the State of the Union. So I know a lot of people are going to be paying attention to that. I myself, I might watch, I might either go back and watch it after it's done or just catch the highlights, just to at least get an idea of what was said and all that. So, anyways, so today, of course, I did. I finished off March of 1946 in terms of my cartoon watching. Um, saw the Popeye cartoon House Tricks, in which Popeye and Bluto basically tried to help Olive build her house. Didn't go over too well. We saw Hair Remover, and from let's see, we saw a couple of Warner Brothers, one Looney Tunes cartoon featuring Porky, Porky and Daffy as substitute. Excuse me there. Anyways, substitute baby factory workers as the baby bottleneck. And then we saw the Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd cartoon, Hair Remover as well. The Mighty Mouse cartoon, My Old Kentucky Home, kind of setting it up as kind of a melodrama kind of thing. So a lot of interesting cartoons in there. So I'm going to go off camera here for a quick moment. I'll be right back, but I will put some music on while I'm gone. And probably when I get back, we'll probably go ahead and talk about what's on tap. All right, I'm back. So let's go ahead and all right. So tonight got one article I'm going to go over tonight from Bleeding Fool, talking about forgotten comic genres. some of you many of you who've watched my historical comic retrospective. Sorry, I'm gonna go off camera one more time here to see if I can clear up my nose a little better here. Sorry about this, folks. All right, I'm back. So, anyways, so as you guys know, if you guys watch the historical comic retrospective, we have looked back on the golden age. We've read, not just superhero titles, but also a number of other genres that don't seem to be quite as popular these days, like westerns, crime noir, um, horror. They're still around, but just not quite as heavy as even romance comics, right? But with all that being said, of course, somebody from Bleeding Fool did decide to write an article about it, so we're going to go over that. It's kind of a lengthy article too, so that's why I picked the one. Of course, afterwards we'll do the wrestling wrap up, get all caught up on last night's pro wrestling action from Monday Night Raw. Look ahead to tonight's NXT. Obviously on the WWE side of it, the final two spots in the Elimination Chamber have been filled. We also got some news on some decisions that have been made in terms of who's going to be on the women's side, who's going to be challenging who. And then we'll wrap things up with this day in each history. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started here then. You just grab the link. And into away we go. As Max Killian said in MASH. Alrighty then, so here we go. One article we're going to do tonight. What really happened to America's lost comic book genres? Article by Victor James, published yesterday, the 23rd. Oh. Let's see what Mr. James has to say here. Recently, DC President and Chief Creative Officer Jim Lee talked to Nickel Extrend about Japanese manga's dominance of the Western comic book market. Yeah, we did see some things with that. There was a part of the conversation that many content creators have keyed in on. And this is a quote from the interview. In Japan, it's closer to, in smaller quotes, literature, and anyone can read it. And it's not just hero stories. There is a much wider range of genres, like stories about cooking and soccer. You can draw stories from that. So I'm very happy that the manga has been so successful, because it gives me in smaller quotes, a goal to aim for, on smaller quote. The manga market is bigger than our industry, so the question becomes, what can we learn from this? Small quote, smaller quote. So yeah, so that was something that he did in fact say, in talking about mangas, because yeah, you do have do have more. Um, Now, granted, because it's Japanese culture, of course, the genres are of course different. Like in our golden age of comics, of course, we had, as I said, we did not only had the superhero stories, but we had like the crime noir stories. We had horror stories. We had, sci and I know horror can kind of fall into sci-fi sometimes, depending upon what kind of horror, but sci-fi, humor, uh, you know, romance. There are even romance comics. Manga have all that in droves. So, and sports and all that. Um, so let's continue on with the article then. This part of the conversation was strange for Jim Lee to admit because, like many content creators are pointing out, manga is just copying off the material American comic book companies started back in the 1930s. Um, maybe the initial style was, but again, they're still applying their own, cultural aspects to it. There are things they're writing about that they're creating there that are unique to Japan. Like the historical comics that cover like periods like the the Edo period, and and feudal Japan and all that. The time of the samurais. You know, time of the ninja clans. So the forgotten comic genres. Before Marvel and DC swallowed a lot of these companies and integrated some characters into their canon, I think in this case he's using the wrong canon here, one and not two. The cannon he's using is the one he used to fire big balls at things, big metal balls at things. I think the canon he wants to put in there is CANON, which means world or universe or what have you. There were many comic book companies that offered genres other than superhero stories. Besides superhero stories, you could find different genres that spoke to Western culture, which is true, and we've seen this quite a bit. We saw this quite a bit. We've been seeing this quite a bit you know, in you know in our Sunday shows. So EC Comics were known for their horror comics that included Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear. But even the big two delved into horror when Marvel Comics published early Tales to Astonish, Journey into Mystery, and Strange Tales, and DC ran House of Mystery and House of Secrets that were enjoyed by fans. And then here's, obviously some covers from some of those books that he just mentioned there. EC Comics did not just produce horror comics, but also crime and war stories, with crime suspense stories, Two Fisted Tales. Yeah, in fact, I believe some of the Comic State guys are actually doing a modern version of Two Fisted Tales, that anthology, and Frontline Combat. Lev Gleason Publications ran the popular series Crime Does Not Pay. At the same time, the big two ran crime and war stories. Marvel Comics had official true crime cases and Crime Exposed, while DC's early detective comics were actually about detecting crime, and they had less popular and that's true. Detective Comics before Batman's debut in Detective Comics 27, it was pretty much a Detective Comics title with the lead feature being Slam Bradley, who would eventually become a supporting character in the DC universe. You had guys like Slam Bradley, like Bart Regan, um, in that book. Those are the only two that come off the top of my head here. Well, even Speed Saunders, even though Speed Saunders would become another supporting character in the Hawkman, well, he was um, Kendra Saunders' grandfather, and I believe he might be at least in post crisis. He's also Shiera's uncle, I believe. So, um, let's see. And then there are some of the books that they just were talking about. Both houses also delved into the war genre, battle war comics, and Navy combat, and our Army at War and Star Spangled War stories. Of course, I'm guessing battle war comics and Navy combat. Those were Marvel titles. I know that our Army at War and Star Spangled War stories were with DC. Star Spangled War Stories was actually born off. Uh, it did not initially start out as I think it started out as Star Spangled Comics and then eventually became Star. Little known Quality Comics also ran war oriented Blackhawk along with GI Combat, which DC picked up. Um, there you go. There. Of course, Western oriented comics were popular as well. Yeah, Western oriented well, Western as a genre across all media were popular. It was not just in comic books, but in obviously in movies, television, all that. Let's see. Golden Arrow was published by Fawcett Comics. Fawcett Comics was, of course, the company that gave us the original Captain Marvel, Bullet Man, Ibis, the Invincible, Mr. Scarlet and Pinky. Um, and Dell Comics ran the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger, which of course eventually became a TV show. Marvel Comics and DC embraced the popularity of westerns, with Marvel Comics printing such comics as Kid Colt Outlaw, Rawhide Kid, and Two Gun Kid, while DC published All Star Western, Western Comics, and Tomahawk. Let me see. I'm trying to remember here. I think Western Comics might have been the company or it might have been the book where like Pow Wow Smith was in, and then All Star Western, the Trigger Twins, I think were in there as well. And he of course had some covers from some of those titles as well. I think and I see that All Star cover reminds me they had for a short time Matt Savage Trail Boss on in there too. These were not the only genres you could find in American comics through the 30s and the 60s, from the 30s to the 60s. Marvel Comics and DC also published romance comics, as I previously mentioned, with My Romance, Love Romances, and Young Romance, Girls Love Stories, Secret Heart, aimed at young women and girls. Let's see. Well, Secret Heart, I think, might have been actually a quality title at first, um, aimed at young girls. While Fiction House EC Comics and Dell Comics tried to draw in boys with their science fiction books, Planet Comics, Weird Science, and Buck Rogers. And you could also argue that the romance, some of the romance genre was interplayed in some other popular comic that maybe where the romance comics were not romance was not the primary genre, but it was a subgenre of like the humor comics, like we're about to get into here. Let's see, 20 minutes already. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that comics also tapped into humor genre with my boyhood favorite Archie comic. As I mentioned too, like in that particular Archie comics, you also had some romance elements there with like Archie and Betty and Veronica and Reggie and all that. Who publishes such gems as Archie and Betty and Veronica. Dell Comics also published Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge, that centered on humor and children. Now, Dell Comics, and I don't know if he'll mention it here a little bit, but Dell Comics, they were probably one of the. I think they were Dell and eventually Gold Key. Dell was actually, I think, one of the first companies to really focus on taking licensing characters from other media. Granted, like Popeye started out in David McKay publications, stuff like that, but Dell really made it a habit of specifically targeting like certain companies. Like Dell would do a lot of the Disney comics back in that time. They they do comics based on, and as time went on, as we got into the TV age, a lot of the TV based comics like Woody Woodpecker, like Warner, or like the Looney Tunes characters, they would also get adaptations by Dell, I believe, throughout much of that time. So here's, of course, what he's referring to: Betty and Veronica, Archie's Mechanics. Let's see, Archie, This is not an exhaustive list, but only to prove the point that manga is just taking from the business model of American comics began long ago. Well, yeah, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah, they it kind of reminds me of a line from Major League, right? Was it? No, actually, no. I'm sorry, not Major League, Mr. Baseball with Tom Selleck, right? In there, Tom Selleck's character, Jack Elliott, is a baseball player. He's been slumping for the last couple of years. And so the team he was on at the time, which was the Yankees, decide to trade him to Japan, where he goes and has a bit of a career resurgence. And there was a line in the movie where his kind of his personal manager slash love interest had the line in there where, well, here in Japan we take the best of the world and we make it better, kind of thing. So they may have copied the business model, but they still improved upon it, and of course put their own touches on it too. So this guy's almost making that sound like, that's a bad thing. That's the nature of, that's one of the natures of, it's not like they out and out stole the idea from, they just took a thing that was already, and made it their own. But so that begs the question: where did these comic genres and others go? Much of the blame can be laid at the feet of the Comics Code Authority. Founded in 1954, the CCA imposed a series of rules that crippled many of these genres, such as and we've talked about that before too. Scenes of excessive violence shall be prohibited. Scenes of brutal torture, excessive and unnecessary knife and gunplay, physical agony, the gory and gruesome crime shall be eliminated. Now, of course, that would affect a lot of the horror and crime noir comics of the time. We've talked many a time about the CCA's effect on the comic. This guy's just rehashing a lot of that. Where over in Japan, they're not, they're not quite as bound by that. No comic magazine shall use the words horror or terror in its title. Yeah, that might have been going a little too far there in terms of, but the thing is, that book that of itself, that would affect again the horror genre right there. But that would tell you right away that book's probably something you want young kids reading. All lurid, unsavory, gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated. So obviously, no violent death scenes, no like blood, gory bodies or anything like that. Nudity in any form is prohibited, as is indecent and undue exposure. Again, the moral compass of the times, that would go obviously. Well, obviously the horror and crime noir comics were probably the most affected, but in the aspect of the nudity, that could also have affected like some of the romance comics and the Western comics, where you might have had some cases of, or any comic that has to do with men and women interacting with each other, and the whole idea of pitching some ideas of romance, right? And the sex perversion or any inference to same is strictly forbidden. Seduction and rape shall never be shown or suggested. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. In other words, and that would have again affected the superhero genre. That would have affected the crime noir drama, because if you remember, as you guys have probably seen, and we've talked about, particularly, actually, in fact, I know the DC wiki. This is part of their one of the notations that we often read. We're talking about some of these books as well, where they talk about how a lot of the books in the 30s, a lot of the comics from the 30s and early 40s were actually would actually depict the idea of corrupt politicians, which of course would foster a feeling of disrespect for such authorities. In fact, I think we even see it today in a way. I mean, you hear the way people talk about politics nowadays, and talk about politicians. Some people might say that to believe that these authority figures are total saints is a bit naive. But I think what people need to understand is that they're human. It's not present. I think in the comics, you know, um, and this is also a time. A lot of this came about because there were a lot of parents who found their kids reading this stuff and felt it was leading to juvenile delinquency. It was a lot of it was based on, of course, we've talked about this too. Frederick Worthen's book "Seduction of the Innocent" or "Seduction of Innocence," um, talking about how a lot of these comics would lead, that would depict a lot of this stuff would lead to juvenile delinquency, and that's what led to the outcry here, right? So, and again, friendly reminder to everybody, if you haven't already, you guys can help out by liking and sharing the screen so we can get some more friendly people to engage. That'd be appreciated. Also, if anything here grabs your attention, feel free to comment and or ask questions, and I will try to answer the questions to the best of my ability. That goes for both my Rumble and YouTube viewers. So anyways, with that pitch being said, let's go ahead and move on to the next bullet point here. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires, and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited, as those were fairly graphic. Again, probably dealing more with the horror genre. In fact, I do remember seeing, I guess, in looking back at on EC Comics, the president of EC Comics, I think, in an interview stated that these were directly focused at him, and that's why he eventually went on to like found Mad Magazine. Crime shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, and to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. There are several other rules, but the message was clear. American comic companies were not forced to follow CCA, but most stores wouldn't. There are several other rules, but the message was clear. American comic companies were not forced to follow the CCA. Now, mind you, too, the CCA was something the comic book companies did as kind of a preemptive strike against the federal government because of Frederick Worthen's book. The HUAC, the House Un-American Committees, Un-American Activity Committee, were going, because of Frederick Worthen's book, because of Seduction of the Innocent, they were going to crack down because a lot of mothers, in particular, that was where the outcry was coming from. Their kids were being exposed to this stuff, and and the whole idea. Well, kids are reading this stuff, but a lot. But we talked too about how a lot of these comics were made for both kids and adults, just like we talk about how the animated shorts of today were initially made for kids and adults. A lot of the like Warner Brothers shorts, MGM shorts, Walter Lantz stuff. A lot of that stuff was made for both adults and kids. Believe it or not. So, but most stores would not order comics that did not have the CCA seal of approval. And there's the seal right there. You can see. For companies that traded in war, science fiction, crime, romance, and gritty Western comics, many of these comic companies either folded or were forced to shut down certain comic lines and only print superhero stories that easily matched the CCA's rigid criteria. Yeah, as I mentioned too earlier, I think um, the owner of EC Comics actually eventually was one of the ones who helped found Mad Magazine in response to all of this. Um, Marvel Comics, and DC were able to survive the CCA's rigidity, but after decades under their censorship, they were trained in producing mainly superhero stories. Even after they broke from the CCA's shackles in the early 2000s, basically, essentially by 2011, the CCA had all but been eliminated. But in a way, even though the CCA is no longer in effect, you still have a lot of for I think different motivations, different drives. The you know a lot of what the CCA did is actually impacting comics in ways you know from what we've seen in certain ways. Since the CCA's demise, independent companies like Alterna Comics have stepped up to offer comics in various. Now there was, I've heard this too, and I know many indie comic creators have talked about this too. There were the quote unquote underground comics of the '70s. Okay, so Alterna and Comicsgate, those are just the newer versions of what they were doing, with the underground comics back in the '70s there, but has stepped up to offer comics in various genres. But the big two have only made half-hearted attempts at reviving these lost genres. DC tried to revive horror and crime with their Vertigo line that fizzled out, and Marvel Comics tried to reskin superhero stories with horror themes, with such comics as Tomb of Dracula, Werewolf by Night, Ghost Rider, and Man Thing. But outside of Vertigo, many of these attempts failed to reach critical mass and were just folded into the main superhero canon. Well, yeah, and I know they did a Sandman series um, in Vertigo that was actually different from the original Sandman that we read on Sundays at times. None of these attempts were a true return to form with dedicated storylines apart from the main superhero canon that wasn't on some random numbered Earth or part of some multiverse to drop the random superhero in. I personally have little faith in Marvel Comics or DC taking the risk of returning to any of these lost genres, and if they did, I have less faith they would not fill those stories with self inserts or personal politics, which we have kind of seen. We have seen quite a bit of that. So, it looks like they're even talking about Bronze Star. So I think the book Mike Barron is actually, yeah. So if American comics are to ever compete with manga's dominance of multiple genres that appeal to wider audience, it will most likely come in the form of independent creators. Legendary comic creator Mike Barron has revitalized the Western comic book genre with his ongoing series Bronze Star, followed by YouTuber Razorfist, whose Western graphic novel Ghost of the Badlands is available on Amazon and where books are sold. There we go there. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to skip that paragraph. My reasons, but Jim Lee was right about another thing in his interview. Manga success is something to strive for. It will be an uphill climb for American creators to reach their level of success since manga is treated as literature and heavily funded by the Japanese government. Mhm. This allows them to take more risk as well to keep their prices low while offering more story pages for the money. Not to mention that most of their manga have one dedicated writer who starts and finishes the stories till the end. Much like our own comic industry had way back when, right? You did have, usually a set creative team, you know, who would write and create characters and all that. Let's see. So, yeah, and we do know about the Japanese government aspect of it because I remember covering a story, and I've talked about this story too, where as everybody knows right now, Japan's going through a population crisis. Young people are not going out and raising families or having babies, so they're and the older generation's dying off without really replenishing their society. So it's gotten so bad that the Japanese Diet, their parliament, has been asking, and I think in some cases begging, for manga creators to create more romance type comics to kind of spur that on, to kind of help replenish the population, as it were. So this is not just a history lesson, but a challenge. I'm no comic creator, but there has to be an American indie comic creator who is willing to take the risk and delve into these dormant genres. There is a massive hole in the comic book industry that is ripe for someone with the talent and vision to fill. Until American comics can figure out how to replicate Japan's success by taking more risk and lowering prices, they will continue to crave manga's comic crown. And in this, that's just an ad there for whatever he's doing. Alrighty then. So there we go with that. That was, as I said, the only article we were going to do tonight. It did take a considerable amount of time, so I was right on that part. Anyways, I do need to step away from the computer for a moment, so I'll be right back. But when I come back, we'll get into the wrestling wrap-up. Alrighty then. So now we'll take a look at the wrestling wrap up. We'll go back to last night's Monday Night Raw, look ahead to tonight's NXT. So, and as I said, the final two spots in the final spots in the elimination chambers, of course, were 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 put into place. Um, and of course, there's some people not happy about some parts of the show. This is a tribute to AJ Styles in his hometown. So, coming from the State Farm Arena in Atlanta, Georgia, with Michael Cole and Corey Graves on commentary, on airing on Netflix here. The opening match of the evening saw Jey Uso. The opening match was the men's final elimination chamber qualifying triple threat match between Jey Uso, Bronson Reed, and El Grande Americano. Jey Uso was the one who advanced, and a lot of fans are not happy about that. Initially, it was actually supposed to be Bronson Reed, but Reed got hurt in the match. He got hurt in the match, in which suffered, I think, a bicep injury. So they on the fly changed the end to Jey Uso winning, and you know you had a segment where Brock Lesnar issued an open challenge where Paul Heyman was with him. With now both Braun Breaker and Bronson Reed now shelved, apparently. Now everything revolving around the Vision is getting kind of set back. Natty defeated Maxine Dupree via referee's decision, a minute and a half. Natty slammed Maxine into the post, and Maxine was actually knocked out, apparently. Javon Evans defeated Kofi Kingston in a singles match in 10 minutes 4 seconds, and then Raquel Rodriguez advanced to the women's elimination chamber, defeating Io Sky and Kairi Sane, hitting Kairi Sane with the Tejana bomb for the finish. So and then, as I said, there, of course, we talked about the Brock Lesnar. You had another situation where Gunther, was essentially Gunther and Dragon Lee had a bit of an incident with each other, and then AJ came out at the end and was basically saying his goodbye. He basically pointed out that the reason he didn't leave his gloves at his last match was because he wanted to do it in Atlanta. Wanted to lay his gloves down in Atlanta, which he did. And as he was finishing up, Undertaker came out, and the Undertaker made the announcement that AJ would be entering the Hall of Fame this year. So AJ, along with Stephanie McMahon, will be entering the WWE Hall of Fame this year. So, all right. So, anyways, now that we went back to last night, now we're gonna, of course, look into tonight's NXT and see what's going to be going down on it. Of course, we'll go over the results for NXT tomorrow. On tonight's NXT, of course, coming from the Performance Center in Orlando, Florida. airing on the CW. You have quite a bit of action going on tonight, as in a match for the NXT North American title, Ethan Page will be defending against Miles Bourne. In the first ever triple threat match for the WWE Speed title, in which the time limit has been expanded from 3 minutes to 7 minutes, Jasper Troy will be defending the title against Elio LaFleur and Eli Knight. JC Jane defends the NXT Women's title against Sol Ruca. Dark States, Osiris Griffin and Shaquan Sugars defend the WNXT Tag Team titles against the Vanity Project's Brad Baylor and Ricky Smokes. In a number one contenders match for the women's speed title, Blake Monroe is set to take on Thea Hall. The winner of that will get a shot at Fallon Henley at some point in the near future. And then in two other matches, in a battle of Chase U, Uriah Connors will be taking on Cale Dixon. And then also Sean Legacy will be taking on Keanu Carver. Now that's all we got for the wrestling wrap-up tonight. So now we're going to go ahead and wrap things up by finishing things off with this day in Niche history, with today being Tuesday, February the 24th, 2026. Let's take a look back at this day in Niche history. History! 2021, 2001, 1951, and 2016. All right. So first off, we're going to head back 75 years ago. And on this date, wrong button, Mike. On this date, 75 years ago today, the Warner Brothers cartoon Putty Tat Trouble premiered in movie theaters on this date back in 1951, 75 years ago. So Putty Tat Trouble is a 1951 Warner Brothers Looney Tunes animated short directed by Fritz Frayling. The short was released on February 24, 1951, and stars Tweety and Sylvester. It also marks the debut of Sylvester's recurring rival, Sam Cat, who would next appear in 1956's Tweet and Sour. So, 75 years ago, Putty Tat Trouble premiered in movie theaters. So now moving on to the next piece of Niche history. As we actually move ahead. Oh, hold on. Oh yeah. We move ahead to the year 2001. On this date in the year 2001, the ECWA had held its fifth annual Super 8 tournament. Now, why is this a big major wrestling piece of history? ECWA is not, of course, one of the major companies. It's the East Coast Wrestling Association. However, this company has been the home of many guys who go on to be stars. And the Super 8 tournament, the tournament that they've held every year, I guess. Let's see, this was the fifth annual one. So since I think the first one is in 1997 there. But such stars as Christian Cage, Bryan Danielson, Low Key, Crowbar, Joey Matthews, who everybody in the WWE knows as Joey Mercury, Christian York, have all spent time there. So let's talk about this event, of course. In the first round matches of the fifth annual Super 8 tournament. Now, Super 8 tournament is a tournament where they invited some of the star, junior heavyweight, cruiserweight, light heavyweight wrestlers from around the country to participate. So in the tournament. So the opening match saw Low Key defeat Low Key, who would of course go on to success as one third of the Triple X faction in TNA. He would defeat Billy Fives in the first round of the tournament. Jason Rain would defeat Tony Corzina. Tony Corzina, of course, a longtime star on the West Coast here. But let's see, Jason Rain. Not really. Then you'd also have American Dragon Brian Danielson defeating Spanky Brian Kendrick. Spanky, another guy who got a start here in California, who would eventually make it to the WWE under his real name of Brian Kendrick, part of the Kendrick and London team of the mid 2000s. And then in the final first round match, Reckless Youth, who was a huge star with ECWA and basically on the East Coast, even had some appearances in ECW, defeated Mike Sullivan. Then in the semifinal matches, of course, Low Key defeated Jason Rain, and American Dragon defeated Reckless Youth. In a number one contenders battle royal, ECWA Summit number one contender, JJ the Ring Crew guy and Patch would go on to earn a shot at the ECWA Heavyweight Champion later that night, who was, of course, which was the next match over, as they both challenged Cheetah Master, another longtime ECWA talent and a former participant in the Super 8 tournament. Cheetah Master, of course, retained the title in that triple threat match. And the main event of the evening saw the tournament final for the Super 8 of Low Key defeating American Dragon, who we all know of as Brian Danielson. So now we'll get ready to move on to the next piece of niche history here. As we move ahead to the year 2016. On this date in the year 2016, as soon as I grab that. On this date in the year 2016, the third one-man punch OVA was released by Madhouse, titled The Overly Complicated Ninja. This OVA was included in the third volume of the One Punch Man home video release. So the third OVA was released along with the third home video release by Madhouse. On this date, 10 years ago, Madhouse would release the third One Punch Man OVA as part of the third home video release. The title of it was The Overly Complicated Ninja. And finally, we move ahead to the year 2021 to get to our last piece of niche history here. On this date in the year 2021, 5 years ago today, the 60th issue of the 5th volume of Amazing Spider-Man went on sale from Marvel Comics. It sold for $3.99. It's 28 pages. The title of the story was No Exit, as written by Nick Spencer, penciled by Mark Bagley, inked by John Dell III and Andrew Hennessy, lettered by Joe Caramagna and Rochelle Rosenberg doing the coloring. So with that being said, I thank everybody for being here tonight. We'll be back here with more niche news tomorrow, of course. Don't forget, this Sunday I'll be joined by Apex from Apex Comics, who will be looking back at comics that went on sale in August of 1940. We'll be focusing in on Dell Comics this Sunday. So with that, I thank everybody for being here, and I hope to see everybody back here tomorrow. Bye.